I felt a weird tingling sensation in my legs when I woke up alone, restrained to an operating table without a clue what was happening. I looked around and saw myself hooked up to lots of machines and had a drip in my arm. And the worst thing was, I had no idea where I was. It was like I had been drugged or my memory had been wiped without a clue where I've been before this moment. This was the scariest moment of my life. I had no idea what to do. I felt a sharp pain in my stomach. My head felt fuzzy and my mouth was dry. I tried to shout out for help, but my voice just came out as a croak. I couldn't move my limbs. I was so frightened. I was all alone and no one could hear me call for help. After a few minutes, a woman came into the room. She was dressed in a white robe and her face was covered in a white mask. She looked like a nurse you'd see in a horror movie. Was I in a hospital? When she noticed that I was awake, she started talking to me in a language I didn't understand. Her tone was weird and aggressive, and I had no idea what she was saying. I started moving my hands and legs, trying to release myself from the machines I was hooked up to. "Get me out of here!" I screamed in pain. But the terror didn't stop there. The scary woman walked over to me and pulled back the blanket covering me and lifted up my gown, which revealed a large bandage on my stomach. What had they done to me? I cried and started to scream louder. With a quick move, I managed to release my hand and I ripped the bandage off even though it hurt and saw a fresh scar and stitches underneath. I had been cut open. All kinds of thoughts started racing through my head. Maybe I had been drugged and someone had taken me to sell my organs on the black market. Or maybe I had been kidnapped and was going to be held for ransom until my mom and dad paid the kidnappers their life savings. Or maybe I'd be murdered and my family would never find my body. It was then that I completely lost it. I screamed more and more and started kicking and hitting out at the nurse. I have to say I'm not usually a violent person. I was just so frightened that I lost all control. Then an even worse pain set in and I looked down at my stomach where the pain was coming from. My stitches had blood coming out of them. The nurse pressed an alarm and more nurses ran in. 2 of them strapped my arms down and another strapped down my legs. I was now really frightened. I was trapped and they could do whatever they wanted to me and I was powerless to stop them. Then a doctor came in and got close to the bed. He was tall and had a mean look on his face. Then he did something that made me even more scared. I was so busy looking at his face that I didn't see what he did, but I felt a sharp pain in my arm. I didn't know what it was, but my vision started to blur and I slowly started falling asleep. He must have given me something to knock me out. I couldn't move and I couldn't resist it anymore. My eyes closed and I was powerless to open them. I didn't know how much time had passed before I woke up the second time, but when I looked beside me, I saw a plate of food that looked weird. I made a guess that this food was for me. Everything they were serving looked mashed and smelled disgusting, but I was very hungry and ended up eating most of it. The room was empty and the drug's effect was wearing off, and that's when I started to remember where I was last before I came here. I knew I wasn't in my home country because not too long ago I was traveling abroad with my 2 besties, Ali and Dahlia, for my 14th birthday. We weren't alone though, my father came with us. My head hurt and I started panicking again when the memory was coming back to me. I knew I was with them not too long ago in the streets of Malaysia. We were eating fried squids from a food chain, but something really bad had happened. The streets were so crowded, and as I was walking with my father and friends, I started feeling a sharp pain in my stomach after all the food I ate. I assumed that it was normal because I was trying out new food, and that's when my father and 2 friends had disappeared. I couldn't see them anymore, and I became very anxious as the pain in my stomach got worse and worse. And that was the last thing I remembered, being lost in a foreign country alone, which explained the whole situation I was in at the moment. Obviously, a gang had kidnapped me after noticing how clueless and lost I was. Oh my god, everything was finally making sense, and I started getting into a state of terror I never felt before. I needed to get out of there right now. My thoughts were disturbed as another person came in. It was the same woman with the white mask, and this time she had pills in her hands that she wanted me to take. When I said no, 2 other men came in and I knew I had to do it, so I decided to play it smart and took the pills and hid them under my tongue and spit it out as soon as they left the room. At that moment, I knew I had to find a way to leave this place, and that's exactly what I did the next morning. After I woke up, a man with a blue mask was standing over me. I was dizzy and felt too weak to move despite being super scared. I looked at the person standing over me with tears in my eyes and asked him politely if I could leave. I begged him in hopes that he'll feel sorry enough for me to let me go. To my shock, this guy with the blue mask called another man who seemed to speak some English, and when I repeated that I needed to leave, he told me with a loud voice, "Money or no leave." "I don't have any money," I screamed, and he replied, "This a big problem. Your mom and dad will pay." It seemed like it didn't matter how much I begged them to let me go. They couldn't care less about my well-being. Only God knows what they would do to me if I didn't pay them. Would they hurt me, or had they already started removing my organs to sell? I started crying, even though I tried to talk and reason with the man. I couldn't help it. I just cried and cried. Eventually, the two men gave up and left me alone in the room. After a while, I managed to calm myself down and realized what I needed to do. I had to escape. My arms and legs were still restrained, and they were really tight. But after a lot of wriggling, I managed to pull my left arm free. Then I managed to undo the restraints on my right arm and my legs. I sat up. I felt lightheaded and my stomach hurt, but I didn't care. I looked down at myself. I was just wearing a gown and my feet were bare. I looked around the room and saw a bag with some clothes and shoes which looked kind of familiar. I tried to get out of bed, but I felt a sharp pain in my arm. I looked at it and saw the drip still attached. I pulled it out and had to stifle a scream. It hurt so much, and my blood spurted across the room as it came out. Somehow I managed to put on the clothes and shoes. I opened the door a crack. It was an empty corridor outside. I knew this could be my only chance before my kidnappers came back. I ran out of the room and down the corridor. I got to the end and there was a door I pushed open. On the other side were loads of people and beds and surrounded by people in masks and robes. The two men who had shouted at me were there too. When they saw me, they ran towards me. They looked so angry. I looked around. I needed to get out. I saw a door leading outside. I ran to it and flung myself against it. I was so dizzy that I could barely hold myself up. I fell outside in a heap on the floor, but I knew I couldn't stop. I stood up and started running. I was in a country that I knew nothing in. Everything looked foreign. The buildings looked different, the cars looked different, and so did the people. I honestly had no plan of how I should get by. But that didn't matter. I just knew that I needed to get away from the place I was being held captive in. I got up and ran, even though I could hear shouting behind me. But after a while, my legs gave way and I collapsed on the floor. I couldn't get up, so I started to crawl, but soon I felt arms around me. I screamed and shouted that I was being kidnapped, but everyone carried on and ignored me. Soon I felt a stabbing pain in my arm again, and it all went dark. As the light was fading, I just felt that this was the end. I wanted to give up. It was dark for a long time before something really strange happened. I woke up after I heard loud voices in my room. When I opened my eyes, I saw that there were 3 policemen standing over there and chatting with my kidnappers. Oh my God! They kidnapped me! I screamed, but the policemen looked like they had no idea what I was saying. How could this situation even be real? They need to catch these bad guys and help me find my parents. But suddenly, I heard familiar voices, and then my mom and dad came in a hurry through my door. They looked so relieved to see me. My mom even started crying, and my kidnappers were standing right beside them, smiling. I screamed, "They kidnapped me!" But that's when my father and mother started laughing and called me silly. "These are doctors," my parents said. Then they explained that I wasn't kidnapped. It was something totally different. After I got lost the other day, my dad couldn't find me, and when he got back to the place I was gone. Apparently, as I was panicking while suffering from severe pain in my stomach, I had fainted on the sidewalk and I had to be transmitted to a hospital quickly. Later on, the doctors discovered that my appendix had burst. They said that the shock, stress, and new food I ate must have affected it. It also took my parents a while before they actually figured out where I was, which had also given them their own share of stress. Eventually, I was super glad that this whole nightmare passed. And I had to apologize so many times to the doctors who were treating me for the hard time I gave them. Have you ever been rushed to a hospital? Or maybe you've been in a situation similar to mine? Tell me your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to hear more stories.